Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and today we're going to dive into the surprisingly seldom discussed half of the United States' deal of the century, the formation of a Palestinian state. Joining us is political strategist and director of English operations with the Yamina Party, Jeremy Saltan, and strategic advisor, Yoram Dori. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us today. I think this is going to be a pretty great debate. I'm excited to have it. But let's get started. So now, for the last few months, Israeli plans to extend sovereignty into Judea and Samaria have practically been the focus of the world. Israel's schedule for the annexations being a major part of President Trump's Middle East Peace for Prosperity outline. But while criticisms aimed at Jerusalem, the conversation shifted away from the latest Palestinian rejection of a real shot to establish a state. So, was it worth it? And more importantly, forget what the PA has rejected and why. The real question is, what do the Palestinians actually want? Yoram, let's start with you. What do the Palestinians ultimately want here?
I think the Palestinians in these days want the same like the Israelis. They want to survive from the coronavirus. That's the main issue. That's the only issue. And there is no other issue on the agenda.
Interesting. All right.
And for the Palestinian survivors, they have to cooperate with Israel. Without cooperation with Israel, they will not survive, and either we.
Jeremy, what's your take on this?
Well, my take is that the Palestinians seem to not really want a state because, let's be honest, every single time they've had an offer on the table, they've said no. They said no to the Peel Commission in the 30s. They said no to the UN partition plan. They said no to various attempts at being able to bring them to the table before the 70s, where there was a break in negotiations. And of course, once we go ahead and see from the Madrid conference forward, every single deal that was put in forth, whether it was Arafat, Abu Mazen, whether it was Camp David, Taba, Annapolis, the John Kerry shuttle talks, you name it, each time there was one side that said no, and that was the Palestinians. It was never the Israelis saying no. The Israelis always said yes. So it's a pretty simple answer to me. Palestinians, quite obviously, do not want a state.
Interesting. Well, I mean, is it that they don't want a state, or is it that they don't want a state with Israel?
Well, look, I mean, it's no secret that I'm an opponent of the two-state solution. That's because I take the Palestinians at their word, and they call it a two-stage solution. So, obviously, if we're in a position in which we're talking about perhaps giving them 100% of what they call the 1967 borders, and then afterwards it was 98%, 95%, 90%. Now Trump is saying, I can still give you some sort of state, but it's going to be now on 70%. They keep saying no. So again, you have to, if you're a Palestinian right now, you have to understand that as time keeps going, your deal keeps getting worse. So if you're really interested in a state, you would have taken it already. So
Yoram, I would agree. I think that it's probably very logical that the main concern worldwide is, of course, the coronavirus, but with the assumption that eventually the coronavirus in some way will be dealt with, what's the next biggest issue in the eyes of the Palestinians?
You are asking me in this debate to become the advocate of the Palestinians.
No, not necessarily. I'm asking the same questions.
Advocate, but you are forcing me to do something that I don't want to do. To quote Arafat in his debates with Shimon Peres that I worked with. He said, you gave to the Egyptian 100% of the territories. You were ready to give to the Syrians 100% of the territories. You gave to the Jordanians 100% plus of the territories. And only us, the beggars, your small neighbor, you want to give only 90%. Why? Because we are so weak.
Well, I mean, so do you think if Israel were to give 100% to the Palestinians, would that work? Do you think that would work? Because let's take the 1967, borders with East Jerusalem and even a Palestinian right of return, which a lot of people have a big issue with because that would, shift the demographics considerably. Do you think that the Palestinians would say yes at that point?
One right of return for the Palestinian. To a Palestinian state, not to Israel. Israel is a sovereign state. Only we will decide who will enter our state, not the Palestinians, and neither in other agreement.
So do you think? I guess
I think the Palestinians want 100% of the territories that we occupied in 1967, or you can call it in other language. I think we occupied these territories.
I first of all have to disagree with the idea that we're occupying territories. Quick, brief history lesson. This was Ottoman Empire territory. The League of Nations gave the British a mandate to create 2 states within this region. Of course, I'm also considering Transjordan since that was part of the mandate. And then since then, Israel was able to be established. There was, of course, the country of Jordan that was established, which also decided to go ahead and take the area which we call Judea and Samaria. They refer to as the West Bank of the Jordan River. And of course, there's never been a state of Palestine. So for you to be able to be occupying it, such as we see in other areas, such as Western Sahara, Northern Cyprus, it needs to be actually under the sovereignty of a separate country. There is no country called Palestine.
That being said, for the sake of discussion, even the Israeli High Court discusses it in terms of an occupation. Because while you might be right that territorially, legally speaking, there's never been a Palestinian state in and of itself, a sovereign Palestinian state, there is today millions of people who identify as Palestinians who live under foreign...
So what the Supreme Court does is actually a distinction between talking about what the land is. They actually refer to, a lot of times, previous Jordanian land. Again, they don't refer to some sort of Palestinian
law. Well, but Jordan
law.
also gave up that land.
No. Of course they did. Of course, after the London talks went nowhere, which of course Yoram could probably talk about from his time with Shimon Peres. But what's important here about this is that when the Supreme Court talks about the land, they don't talk about the land under Palestinian law. It's Jordanian law. It's British mandate law. It's Ottoman law. When it comes to the people themselves, yes. When it comes to the Palestinians, it will refer to them specifically as having, according to international law, being under the jurisdiction of what they would consider to be occupation. But that's very different. You have to separate the people from the territory.
All right. Now, Yoram, you mentioned Jordan, you mentioned Egypt, and a few other nations in the Middle East that Israel has either made peace with or has normalized ties with. So what are the conditions under which a true peace or normalization can flourish or can come to exist between Israel and other Arab states?
My colleague said that there is a 2-stage solution. I know it from 1973, when Anwar Sadat in 1977 came with his peace initiative. Everyone said it's also a 3-stage initiative. First of all, to go back to the international border and then to destroy Israel. So we are, I think, 50 years after it, and we have peace with Egypt. A cold peace is much better than warm war. And I think the same can be with the Palestinians. 50% and more of the population in Jordan are Palestinians, the same Palestinians who live in the West Bank. Why can we live in peace with the Palestinian in Jordan and not with the Palestinian in Nablus?
Well, so returning the question back to you, why is it then that Israel can have a peace with Jordan, but not with the Palestinians in the West Bank?
It's a problem of leadership in both sides. We have to have the courage to decide that we are ready to go back to the 67 borders and to create something like 2-state solution, because it's not a real Palestinian state with not full sovereignty, with no harbor, with no airport, with no army. I can't identify exactly what will it be, but I'm against that Israel will become South Africa with apartheid.
Well, so
if you want to have the West Bank part of the state of Israel, please be honest and say one man, one vote, and then we'll have Mr. Abu Mazen as a vice prime minister of Israel instead of Benny Gantz.
Yeah, Yoram, I respect you a lot, but you say you don't want to be the Palestinian advocate, and then you start to just drop the A-bomb of apartheid and start really adopting their messaging, which I would encourage you not to do. I think it's very clear, again, the reason that there is no state is because the Palestinians have said no every single time. And even when they were offered very close to 100%, they said no. And I think the reason is because, like I said, it's not enough for them, the 67 borders. They still have visions of a Palestinian state, which includes many parts of what you would consider mainland Israel. And when they're talking about refugees returning to their homes, they're not talking, as Yoram is, about them going to Ramallah or Bethlehem. They're talking about going to Jaffa. They're talking about going to Jerusalem. They're talking about going to Haifa. They're talking about going to Tiberias. You know, this is just a situation where, unfortunately...
You want to go back to Nablus.
No, I don't want to go to Nablus. Don't go ahead and put... Yoram, please. I didn't put words in your mouth. You don't put words in my mouth.
Every Jew has a dream about Nablus.
I don't have a dream about Nablus.
Dreams. Let the Palestinians have their dreams.
Listen, they can have their dreams. I'm not trying to take away their dreams. I'm saying that the maximum that Israel is going ahead and is willing to give is really just not the minimum the Palestinians are willing to accept. And to put us back on course, with what Trump is trying to do here, look, what President Trump is trying to do is he's saying, let's make a change. Instead of talking about the way that things were in the 1930s or the 1960s, let's talk about what the facts on the ground are in 2020. Instead of talking about things in the abstract and looking at previous proposals from decades ago, let's talk about what's actually happening here today. And the truth is that Palestinians refuse to go ahead and have that change of paradigm and talk about what is today. But what I feel is this. You know, the Palestinians have wasted time. It's not a situation of leadership. It didn't matter if it was Rabin, Peres, Barak, Olmert, Netanyahu on the Israeli side. It didn't matter if it was Arafat or Fayyad or Abu Allah or Abu Mazen, you know, who's known, of course, as Mahmoud Abbas on the Palestinian side. The Palestinians do not want to come to make peace with us.
I want to interject, actually, because I want to ask, do either of you see a difference really between the Palestinian leadership and what they're saying and what they're willing to accept versus what the people on the ground, the Palestinian citizens, are saying that they are willing to accept?
I do. You know, I'll say, and this is something I've said many times before, instead of putting money, the international community puts a lot of money into the PA institutions, they should put more money to people activities. When I go ahead and I do have a chance, and I do, speak to Palestinians, I hear many times very, very, very different things than what I hear from the Palestinian leadership. It's very possible that if we are looking in a decade plus, we'll find some Palestinians who are a lot easier to talk to, but it's certainly not going to be people who are members of this current Palestinian Authority government, which of course has not had presidential elections since 2005 or parliamentary elections since 2006. And of course, it won't be Hamas in Gaza or Islamic Jihad either. So, you know, there is a window of opportunity for someone to emerge, but that window is very, very small, and it's probably going to close before they're able to do something substantial with it.
Yoram?
I don't believe that peace can be forced. Peace is a result of negotiation with goodwill from both sides. And let's assume that I'm going with my colleague. The Palestinians are refusing any Israeli proposal. So we have to try harder not to give up on security measures of Israel, but to try again and again. And at least we will find a way to reach an agreement.
The definition of insanity is trying the same thing over and over again.
That there will be peace as it is between Great Britain and Germany. Nobody. But you see, the relations today between Great Britain and Germany, it can be between us and our neighbors. We have to try harder, they have to try harder. We have to have more courage, they have to have more courage. We have to withdraw from our part of our dreams, they have to withdraw from part of our dreams. We have to recognize that our neighbors are the Palestinians, not the Sweden, and the Palestinians to recognize that their neighbors are the Israelis and not the Norwegians. That's life. You know, we have to be pragmatic.
Yoram was talking about our previous peace agreements. The Egyptians came to recognize Israel as a Jewish state we made a deal with them. The same with the Jordanians. Even the Syrians under Assad were considering going in that route, and there were direct negotiations. When it comes to the Palestinians, they have just refused. They've gone from the strategy of big armies against us, which since 1973 everyone realized was not the way to go about things. And they went ahead and embraced, terrorism, 2 intifadas, maybe 2.5 intifadas, if we're going to, consider what we saw a few years ago. And what we saw each time is that it didn't work. Now they're going to BDS. Now they're going to attempts at linkage within the international community to try to go ahead and defeat us through a different way. But what they need to do is just recognize that we exist. They have to understand that we're a Jewish state. That was the UN decision. That wasn't the Israeli decision.
What do you see as a practical move forward?
So I think, again, whether I agree with it or not, what Donald Trump did is he went to the Palestinians and said, listen, this is the best deal you guys are going to get in terms of something the Israelis can actually implement. Because when Yoram is talking about the deals that Shimon Peres put on the table, yes, in the 90s, those were possible deals. We're 2020. You cannot make those deals anymore. You cannot make deals where you take 500,000 Israeli citizens and remove them from their homes. There are still stories from 15 years ago of less than 10,000 settlers that we removed from the Gaza Strip that have still not found permanent homes. Does anyone really think that we can do that on 50 or 100 times that scale? When we already have a housing shortage, when we're especially dealing with Corona and other big issues within a budget of 3 elections that we didn't need over the last year and a half, we just need to be realistic. So what Trump is doing is saying to the Palestinians, listen, this is your last chance. If you want a state, this is your opportunity to get it. If you don't, the Israelis are going to be allowed to move in, start doing moves unilaterally on their own, and we'll see what happens.
Yoram?
You convinced me, but you have to convince Abu Mazen. I'm not your partner. You have to convince him.
I don't need to convince
He can have the same speech towards the Israelis.
Exactly. Yoram, I don't
now
need to.
Living in 2020, not in 1960.
Look, Yoram, I wish that maybe one of the 3 elections that the Israelis had this year, the Palestinians would have. I think both of us understand that if there was an election today, Mahmoud Abbas probably would not end up winning, not just because of his age, but because he's probably no longer representing a majority of the Palestinian people. Now, I understand there are concerns that he could have Hamas or someone even worse go ahead and replace him. But I don't need to go ahead and convince, Mahmoud Abbas. What I need to try to do is convince the Palestinians, which I think there are a lot of Palestinians, like I said, from a lot of people-to-people meetings that are starting to understand, a lot of regional leaders are starting to understand that, listen, if we don't do something soon, we're going to have absolutely no shot to get anywhere. Let's talk a minute about this aspect of unilateralism. When the Palestinians unilaterally went to the ICC, when the Palestinians unilaterally decided to join UN bodies, where were members of the international community telling them that based on the Oslo Accords, they couldn't go ahead and do unilateral moves? Yoram, you were a big central part in, writing this, drafting these things, and of course, being there alongside Shimon Peres during this point in time. When the Israelis say, listen, we are going to respond to your unilateral moves with our own unilateral moves that we did not do because of the Oslo Accords, then suddenly people are against unilateralism. Can you explain that?
You mentioned the BDS and the political measures that the Palestinians are using now against Israel. I think that to use political measures is much better than suicide bombers. And you see that they are cooperating with Israel to stop suicide bombers, to stop the killing of Israelis as much as they can. And it's much better. So I'm not afraid. We are so strong. I'm not afraid from BDS and other initiatives.
Yoram, I agree with you that we shouldn't be afraid of that. The point that I was trying to make is the Palestinians went from trying to kill us with armies to trying to kill us with terrorism and intifadas. And they saw that it just doesn't work because you're right. The Israeli resolve is so strong. You cannot break us. So now they're trying BDS. And again, even you, who's a representative of the left, is saying that this BDS business is not going to break us either. So the Palestinians need to understand they have to be willing to change their negotiating position. They need to stop with the linkage. They need to stop expecting that if they try to figure out a way to connect this to some other thing, from Black Lives Matter to whatever might be going on in whatever guerrilla warfare throughout the Middle East or Africa, that there's not anything you can do. The Palestinians refuse to sit face to face with the Israelis. Yep. And when it comes to the honest mediator that isn't part of this, which is the Americans who want to be a part, but the Palestinians won't even let them be a part of it.
Yoram?
I'm not an advisor of the Palestinians. Maximum, I'm an advisor of the Israelis. And there is one thing that I know that is a disaster for Israel, a one-state solution. One-state solution is a disaster for Israel. You can see what happened in Jerusalem. We have 300,000 Palestinians in Jerusalem. And if they will be a little bit more clever from their point of view and elect a Palestinian to mayor, he would be elected as a mayor of Jerusalem. Not Moshe Leon with 100,000 voters, but a Palestinian leader with 300,000 voters. So please, you have to understand that one-state solution is a disaster, and for me, as the end of Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state.
All right, well, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have today. Yoram, Jeremy, Saltan, thank you both so much for joining us today. And make sure to tune in next time on Insider for more in-depth analysis on everything Israel. Also, if there's a topic that you want us to cover next, please let us know in the comment sections online. Finally, remember that for more news from Israel, follow ILTV on Facebook, like us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV channels. I'm Aaron Porras. Thank you so much for watching.